I want you to think about the last time you were promised something quickly that did not arrive quickly. Not a catastrophic failure, just the specific feeling of watching a clock that was supposed to have hands, a defined endpoint, a promised resolution, and discovering that the hands were never there to begin with. 2 months ago, the framing around American military engagement in the Gulf was swift, decisive, overwhelming. 2 months later, I am looking at a ledger, and the generational witness in me, someone who has watched this specific pattern repeat across Vietnam, across the first Gulf War's aftermath, across Iraq, across Afghanistan, recognizes this ledger. The items on it are familiar.
The lesson they teach has been available for 70 years, and yet here we are, reading it again. What Trump actually got from 2 months of maximum pressure, military operations, ceasefire extensions, reversed ultimatums, Chinese vessel seizures, Pakistani mediations, Omani back channels, and a no-deal signal that removed the diplomatic circuit breaker is not what was promised. It is not a catastrophe either, in the dramatic, immediate sense. It is something more durable and more frustrating, a more dangerous Iran, a more established China, a more positioned Russia, and a more expensive baseline for every resolution that will eventually have to happen. That is what 2 months of military superiority without a political endpoint produces. It has produced it before. It is producing it now. Tonight I want to do what the coverage is not doing, read the ledger out loud, not to assign blame.
To provide the honest accounting that allows the skeptic watching this to understand exactly what was gained, what was lost, and what the pattern that produced this outcome looks like when you have watched it operate across enough iterations to recognize it by its shape. I have watched American foreign policy manage military superiority without political endpoints across several generations of conflict. The specific lesson that the historical record teaches, and that the coverage of each new iteration consistently fails to connect to the previous ones, is this: military superiority is a tool for destroying things. It is not a tool for producing political outcomes. Political outcomes require a defined endpoint, a negotiated framework, and an adversary that has been given a specific and credible reason to accept terms. 2 months of military operations in the Gulf have destroyed some things. They have not produced a political endpoint. That is the ledger.
Let me read it. One sentence. 2 months of maximum pressure have produced the most expensive lesson in recent American foreign policy history. That military superiority without a diplomatic endpoint does not defeat adversaries, it strengthens them, and the specific adversaries who are stronger today than they were when the 2 months began are the ones whose strengthening most directly threatens the interests the 2 months were supposed to protect. Start with the forensic accounting of what was promised. The public framing at the beginning of this engagement, in presidential statements, in administration official communications, in the press briefing characterizations of American military operations, contained specific implied promises: swift resolution of the nuclear threat, decisive pressure that would force Iranian behavioral change, a ceasefire framework that would hold, a negotiating track that would produce terms, the credibility of American ultimatums enforced rather than reversed.
The shadow fleet disrupted. Iranian oil revenues constrained sufficiently to change Iranian behavior. Read those promises against the 2-month ledger. The nuclear threat. Iran's enrichment program is intact. IAEA inspections are suspended. And Iran has more international legitimacy for its program than it had at the start of the 2 months, having been attacked by a nuclear-armed non-NPT state while being an NPT signatory. The ceasefire framework. 3 deadline cycles, 2 reversals, 1 no-deal signal, no durable framework. The negotiating track. The Omani back channel exists, but its function has been degraded by the no-deal signal. Pakistan's mediation was refused. The Shah-Salman call demonstrated that resolution, if it comes, will require Chinese and Saudi participation that gives both actors credit the United States will not receive. The shadow fleet. Operational, documented, and expanding.
Iranian oil revenues. Constrained but flowing through Chinese purchase architecture at 90% share, producing a budget that is stressed but surviving. The specific promises and the specific outcomes are not a matter of partisan interpretation. They are items on a ledger. The ledger does not balance. Now map how Iran is stronger today than when the 2 months began, because this is the hidden accounting that the coverage is not doing, and it is the accounting that most directly refutes the premise of the swift victory framing. Iran's enrichment program is at a higher capability level than it was 2 months ago.
The strikes on nuclear infrastructure caused real damage. We documented that in an earlier video. But the material was not destroyed. The political will to reconstitute is stronger than before the strikes. And the suspension of IAEA inspections means the international community has less real-time visibility into what the program is doing now than at any point since the 2015 JCPOA. The 2 months have produced a nuclear Iran that is less transparent, more politically justified in its program, and operating without the inspection architecture that was the world's primary early warning mechanism. Iran's diplomatic position is stronger. The UN General Assembly vote condemning the strikes passed with the support of virtually every African, Latin American, and Asian state outside the immediate U.S. alliance system.
The piracy framing, legally contested but diplomatically effective, has given Iran a narrative of sovereign victimhood that it did not have before the marine boarding operation. The Global South alignment calculation we mapped in the context of Xi's Law of the Jungle speech has moved in Iran's favor over 2 months of American operations that provided Beijing with the most effective soft power advertising it has generated in years. Iran's proxy network, while degraded by the months of pressure preceding this 2-month period, has demonstrated resilience and adaptation. Hezbollah's ceasefire compliance, while partial, has allowed reconstitution that the 2 months of Gulf focus have not interrupted. The Houthi operational capacity has not been eliminated. The Iraqi militia network has not been dismantled. Each of those proxy relationships has survived the 2 months in a form that will be available for activation when the strategic calculation shifts. Now map how China is stronger.
This is the accounting that the coverage most consistently fails to make, and it is the most consequential item on the ledger. China's consolidation window, which we mapped extensively in earlier videos, has been open for 2 months. The specific assets Beijing has been building during the Gulf distraction period, semiconductor alternative development, Belt and Road connectivity, Yuan settlement architecture, Gulf diplomatic relationships, have had 2 months of reduced American oversight and attention. 2 months is not decisive, but 2 months of reduced enforcement pressure on semiconductor export controls, 2 months of Belt and Road project advancement, 2 months of Yuan settlement normalization in Gulf crude trade. Each of those adds to the compounding advantage that was the subject of the previous video. China's diplomatic positioning has improved dramatically.
The Xi-Salman call established Chinese willingness to engage directly in Gulf security architecture for the first time. The validation of Iran's piracy framing, provided through Chinese foreign ministry statements that stopped short of endorsing the label but explicitly contested the U.S. legal justification, has positioned Beijing as a credible legal challenger to American Maritime Enforcement Authority in ways that will be usable in the South China Sea and other contested waterways. The Law of the Jungle speech, which the Gulf crisis made maximally resonant with its global South target audience, has advanced China's soft power positioning against the backdrop of American behavior that provided the speech's most effective evidence. China's 90% purchase architecture has survived 2 months of the crisis intact. The shadow fleet has not been shut down. The teapot refineries have continued processing Iranian crude. The Bank of Kunlun and associated financial channels have continued processing yuan-denominated transactions. The free-riding strategy has accumulated 2 months of benefit. Military spending not spent, diplomatic capital not expended, Belt and Road projects advanced, while the United States has absorbed 2 months of direct cost. Now map how Russia is stronger. This accounting is the most underreported of the three because the coverage treats the Gulf crisis as a separate story from the Ukraine conflict, and the connection between them is precisely what the coverage is missing. Russia's dark fleet, the shadow shipping network that moves Russian crude in defiance of the Western price cap, has had 2 months of reduced enforcement attention. American enforcement officials who are managing the Chinese origin vessel seizure, the Iranian sanctions architecture, and the Gulf operational demands are not simultaneously managing the maximum possible enforcement of the Russian crude price cap. The enforcement attention is finite. The Gulf crisis has consumed a measurable proportion of it. Russian crude continues to move through the dark fleet at volumes that the price cap was designed to reduce. Russia's broader strategic position has benefited from 2 months of American attention divided between the Gulf and Ukraine. The military and political bandwidth of the American national security apparatus is not infinite. 2 months of intensive Gulf management has meant 2 months in which the Ukraine support architecture, political messaging, congressional budget cycles, allied coordination has received secondary rather than primary senior attention. The specific consequences of that secondary attention are not immediately visible. They compound over months into reduced allied coordination, reduced political momentum for Ukrainian support, and a negotiating environment that becomes progressively less favorable to Ukrainian interests. Russia's diplomatic positioning in the broader multipolar contest has benefited from 2 months of American credibility erosion. The reversed ultimatums, the extension cycles, the no-deal signal, each of those events is data in the Russian assessment of American commitment reliability. We traced that connection in the video on the 3-hour reversal. 2 months of those events accumulated is 2 months of Russian assessment updating toward a conclusion that American pressure has defined limits that can be tested. Now read the historical comparative, the pattern that this outcome instantiates, because this is the dimension that the skeptic watching this has the most right to be frustrated about. The pattern is not new. It is not subtle. It has been documented across every major American military engagement of the past 70 years, and the documentation is available in official government reviews, in academic strategic studies, in the testimony of the officials who managed the previous iterations. The lesson that military superiority does not produce political outcomes without a defined diplomatic endpoint is not a secret. It is the most consistently documented finding in American strategic literature. Vietnam, overwhelming military superiority, no defined political endpoint, adversary that adapted and survived, more dangerous regional situation at the end of the engagement than at the beginning. The lesson was formally documented in the Pentagon Papers, in the official Army history of the conflict, in the subsequent doctrine review that produced the Weinberger Doctrine and later the Powell Doctrine, both of which specified that military force should only be used when there is a clear political objective and a credible exit strategy. Those doctrines were available. Iraq, 2003, the fastest military victory in modern history. Baghdad fell in 3 weeks, followed by years of political failure because the political endpoint was never defined before the military operation began. The Iraq Survey Group's report, the Baker-Hamilton Commission's report, the official Army history of Operation Iraqi Freedom, all of them document the same finding. Military superiority destroyed the existing order without creating the conditions for a replacement order. The lesson was documented. It was available. Afghanistan, 20 years of military operations, trillions of dollars of expenditure, the most technologically sophisticated military force in history, against an adversary with no air force, no navy, and no armored vehicles, produced a political outcome that restored the pre-war government to power within weeks of the military withdrawal. The lesson of Afghanistan is the starkest possible demonstration that military superiority and political outcomes are different categories of achievement, and that the possession of the first guarantees nothing about the second. 2 months of Gulf operations sit in this lineage. The specific content is different. The structural outcome is consistent with the pattern. And the frustration the skeptic feels watching this pattern repeat is justified. not because the outcome was inevitable, but because the lesson that would have prevented it has been available, documented, and ignored in each iteration. The clock without hands in this story is the political endpoint that was never defined before the military operations began. A clock without hands still tells a certain kind of time. It marks duration. It accumulates cost. It records the passage of each day in which the gap between what was promised and what exists grows wider. But it cannot tell you when the resolution arrives, because the resolution was never placed on the clock face. 2 months into the engagement, the political endpoint is still not defined. The no-deal signal has not been followed by an alternative framework. The Omani back channel has not produced terms. The Chinese-Saudi facilitation architecture exists, but has not been given a specific mandate. The IRGC's pressure has not produced an Iranian military action, but neither has it been resolved. The enrichment program continues. The shadow fleet continues. The 90% purchase architecture continues. The clock runs. The hands are not there. The specific cost of a clock without hands, the cost of 2 months of military operations, diplomatic capital expenditure, ceasefire extension cycles, reversed ultimatums, vessel seizures, and no-deal signaling without a defined political endpoint, is not only financial, though the financial cost is real and large. It is the cost of capability advancement by adversaries who have used the 2 months to become more capable. It is the cost of credibility erosion that makes the next pressure cycle less effective than this one. It is the cost of opportunity, the things that American strategic attention and resources would have been doing in other theaters if they were not consumed by this one. And it is the cost that compounds. Each month without a political endpoint adds to the price of the eventual resolution that will have to happen anyway, under worse conditions, from a weaker position. The Trump administration faces the most precise version of the lesson the historical record has been trying to teach. Military superiority without a diplomatic endpoint does not produce swift victory. It produces prolonged engagement at compounding cost, with adversaries who are stronger at the end of each month than at the beginning, and a domestic political audience that was promised swift victory and has received neither victory nor swiftness. The specific responses available: return to a deal-seeking posture, maintain no-deal pressure, escalate to direct conflict, accept multilateral resolution with Chinese and Saudi involvement. Each carries costs that the swift victory framing made it politically impossible to acknowledge were on the table. Iran has survived 2 months in a form that its leadership will correctly characterize as resilience, not against American military capability, which was never in question, but against American political will to absorb the costs of a sustained conflict. That characterization is available to the IRGC commanders who argued for a more forceful response to the Marine boarding, to the domestic political base whose legitimacy narrative is built on resistance to external pressure, and to the global South audience whose alignment calculations are updated by each month of Iran's survival. The 2 months have not been a propaganda victory for Tehran. They have been too costly for that framing. But they have not been a defeat either, and in a conflict where Iran's survival is itself the objective, not defeat is a form of victory. China and Russia have spent 2 months doing what they were already doing, but with reduced American oversight and attention, and with accumulating diplomatic positioning benefit. That is not dramatic. It does not look like winning from the outside. It is winning from the inside, the patient accumulation of advantage that the period of strategic opportunity doctrine was designed to produce. Scenario 1. The clock gets hands. A political endpoint is defined through the Omani back channel, through Chinese-Saudi facilitation, or through a direct American initiative that gives Iran a specific, credible path to sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable nuclear constraints. The 2 months become the pressure that produced the conditions for a deal. The adversaries who gained strength during the 2 months retain those gains. There is no reversing the enrichment advancement, the Chinese consolidation, the Russian positioning, but the deal arrests the further compounding. This scenario requires a political reversal of the no-deal signal significant enough to restore the economic incentive for Iranian restraint. The domestic political cost is real. The strategic benefit is real. Whether the calculation favors it depends on who is in the room when the calculation is made. Scenario 2. The clock continues without hands. No political endpoint is defined. The engagement extends into months 3 through 6 with the same pattern. Ceasefire cycles, pressure, partial responses, no resolution. Adversaries continue to strengthen incrementally. The war risk premium in oil markets remains a structural feature. The compliance landscape for China-connected trade remains elevated. The Omani back channel remains dormant or suboptimal. The pattern continues until a threshold event, an IRGC escalation, a Gulf state crisis, a Chinese-American confrontation over a vessel, forces a discontinuity that the clock without hands cannot absorb. This is the most likely scenario and the one that the historical pattern most strongly predicts. Scenario 3. Escalation to direct conflict resolves the clock by destroying it. A military escalation of sufficient scale produces regime change in Iran, or a military defeat so comprehensive that the political outcome changes. This scenario has been available in every iteration of the pattern. It was available in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in every iteration it has either not been pursued or has been pursued and produced outcomes worse than the engagement it was supposed to resolve. The cost of the scenario that resolves the clock by destroying it is higher than the cost of the engagement it terminates. That has been true consistently. It is true now. Scenario 4. Multilateral resolution redefines the clock. China, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the European powers facilitate a comprehensive framework that includes verified Iranian nuclear constraints, sanctions relief on a defined schedule, and regional security architecture that addresses the security concerns of multiple parties simultaneously. The clock gets hands placed on it by actors other than the United States, with the United States accepting a co-participant role rather than the primary architect role. This scenario produces a durable resolution at the cost of American primacy in its design. It is the most constructive outcome. It requires the most institutional adaptation from Washington. And the 2 months have moved it from a theoretical possibility to a structural likelihood, because the Chinese and Saudi facilitation architecture that this scenario requires now exists in a form it did not have before the 2 months began. If you are a skeptic who has watched this pattern before, who remembers the swift victory framing from previous iterations, who watched the gap between the promise and the ledger open in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the 2-month ledger of the Gulf engagement is exactly as frustrating as your pattern recognition tells you it should be. The lesson has not changed. The pattern has not changed. The gap between military superiority and political outcomes has not changed. What has changed, iteration by iteration, is the cost of learning the lesson again, and the strength of the adversaries who have used each iteration to become more capable while the clock ran without hands. The controlled frustration the honest skeptic feels is not defeatism. It is the correct response to watching a system that has the information it needs to avoid a pattern, and chooses, through a combination of domestic political constraints, institutional inertia, and the seductive clarity of military options versus the messy complexity of diplomatic endpoints, to repeat it anyway. The frustration is productive when it asks the right question. Not why did this happen again, but what would it take to break the pattern the next time the clock is set running without hands? 2 months in, the most honest thing I can tell you is this: the adversaries are stronger. The political endpoint is still undefined. The clock is still running without hands, and the lesson that was supposed to have been learned in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan is available again, documented, available, and pending the political will to act on it that has been missing in every previous iteration. Let me read the final ledger. Trump promised swift victory. 2 months later, Iran's nuclear program is intact and less transparent than before. China has consolidated 2 months of advantage during the distraction window. Russia has accumulated 2 months of reduced enforcement pressure on its crude price cap and 2 more months of credibility reassessment data. The ceasefire has cycled without resolution. The no-deal signal has removed the economic incentive for Iranian restraint. The Omani back channel is suboptimal. The Gulf states' diplomatic assets have been partially devalued. The war risk premium is now a structural feature in oil markets. The compliance landscape for China-connected trade is elevated. The ledger does not balance against the promise. The generational witness records this not with satisfaction. There is no satisfaction in watching a familiar pattern produce familiar costs, but with the obligation to name it clearly. Military superiority without a political endpoint does not produce political outcomes. It has not produced them in any iteration of this pattern in the past 70 years. It has not produced them in 2 months in the Gulf. The clock without hands runs. The adversaries strengthen. The eventual resolution, when it comes, will be negotiated from a weaker position, at higher cost, under worse conditions than were available on day one. The question the skeptic needs answered going forward is not whether the pattern will repeat. It is which specific actor, in which specific institutional position, has both the information and the political incentive to define the endpoint that puts hands on the clock. In the current architecture, with the Omani back channel suboptimal, the no-deal signal reducing the diplomatic track, and the Chinese-Saudi facilitation architecture now established, that actor is most likely not in Washington. It is in Beijing or Riyadh. And the cost of the political endpoint being defined by Beijing or Riyadh rather than Washington is the final item on the ledger that 2 months of military superiority without a diplomatic endpoint have produced. Here is what I want you to sit with. If you were the official in the American national security system who has read the Vietnam ledger, the Iraq ledger, and the Afghanistan ledger, and who is now looking at the 2-month Gulf ledger, what single institutional change would you make to ensure that the next time a clock gets set running, it has hands on it before the military operations begin, not a tactical adjustment, an institutional one, the change that breaks the pattern? Leave it in the comments. The most structurally precise answers I will read in the follow-up.